Janine, over to you.
Thank you very much for that excellent introduction. Yeah, having left the RMT executive on the 1st of January, I'm now back in my proper job as a London Underground station supervisor. Although the equivalent of clause in my contract, having mentioned that fact, I should now tell you that nothing I say tonight should be taken to represent the views of Transport for London or any of its subsidiary companies. I'm hoping that by the time I finish, you'd have worked that out from what I've said. So I basically want to make 3 points in my 10 minutes. Firstly, I want to talk about rail privatisation and renationalisation and reiterate and expand on what John said about the importance of it being in Labour's general election manifesto. Secondly, I want to talk about the London Underground Public-Private Partnership because it's a very salutary lesson in what Labour can do wrong when it's in government, and it also will give me another opportunity to plug my book. And thirdly, I want to talk about why, although broadly agreeing that we should be in favour of nationalisation, why that is not enough, and maybe not even the best term. And that we have to go forward for that. So save the controversy for last. We'll concentrate during the earlier bits of the speech, I'm hoping. Okay, so rail privatisation. British Rail was privatised under John Major's government. It was a disaster. You don't need me to tell you or to itemise in what way it was a disaster, and I've only got 10 minutes. Obviously I could spend 10 days telling you what was wrong with the privatisation of the railway. To summarise, crashes, lots of people being killed, rip-offs, huge fares increases, much higher public subsidy going into the railways than did when it was publicly owned, and fat cats making huge profits at the expense of the service. And essentially, that's what happens when you invite the profit motive into a public service. It's not like some people say, it was botched, it was ill thought out. It wasn't botched or ill thought out. It was what happens when you introduce the profit motive into something that should be run for need of a public service and not for private profit. And it is essential that the Labour Party must pledge to renationalise the railways in its general election manifesto, and if it wins that general election, must carry out that pledge. And it should do that actually not just because it's the right policy, although mainly because it's the right policy, but it's actually the democratic thing for it to do, and it would be a popular vote-winning thing for it to do as well. It's a democratic thing to do because it's clearly the will of the Labour movement that the Labour Party should have that in its general election manifesto. Last year's Labour Party conference unanimously passed a resolution moved by the TSSA and ASLEF that Labour should renationalise the railways. There are motions which I wholeheartedly expect to be passed to this year's RMT annual general meeting next month and to Unite's policy conference, which I think is at the beginning of July, both calling for Labour to include renationalisation of the railways in its general election manifesto. Just about a week ago, 30 prospective parliamentary candidates for the Labour Party put their name to a letter calling on the party to renationalise the railways. Opinion polls consistently show 70% plus of people in favour of the renationalisation of the railways. And even the Labour Party leadership is now hinting and edging in that direction. It's now saying things like, we're open-minded to a possible form of public open. Steady on, steady on. I think the latest form this is taking is that East Coast, which is in public hands at the moment because the private owner completely fecked it up, the Tories are trying to asset strip it and give it back to the private sector. If they fail to do that by the general election, if it's still in public ownership, I think the Labour Party are now saying they'll keep it in public ownership. So, you know, if you do that with East Coast, why not the whole lot? In fact, even the whole argument about we can't afford to do it is now running out of any kudos because virtually all franchises are up for renewal over the next few years, so they can simply say we're not refranchising it. We'll keep it in public ownership. So I can feel a movement growing here, a movement from the rank and file, from the grassroots of the Labour movement. The Labour Party should have renationalisation in its manifesto. And I think we've got a name for this movement as well. We should call it Grillum. Get rail renationalisation in Labour's election manifesto. Okay, so everyone sign up to this movement called Grillum. Right, so the London Underground, see John's already joined. The London Underground and the Public-Private Partnership. This was New Labour's policy in government between 1997 and 2010. It was an absolute disaster. If you want to read all the gory details, then book at the end. But let me sum up the story of it for you, because I've only got a couple of minutes on this point, okay? So by 1997, the Tube was in a desperate state. It had been so badly underfunded for such a long time. The Tories went into the general election saying they were going to privatise it. The Labour Party went into the general election saying that's a terrible idea. We're going to have something called a public-private partnership, that we're not going to tell you quite what it is. Labour won a landslide in that general election, actually got a higher swing from the Tories in London than it did across the country as a whole, which may well have been to do with that policy on the Underground. Once it got elected, Labour set up a working party to decide what public-private partnership on the Tube actually meant. But rather than this working party consisting of possibly, trade unionists or rank-and-file Labour Party members, or heaven forbid, people who work on the Underground, its working party consisted of Geoffrey Robinson and several other millionaire business people assisted by Price Waterhouse. So it probably shouldn't have come as a surprise a year later when they revealed what the public-private partnership was. And it was that the infrastructure of London Underground, the maintenance and repairs and upgrades, etc., would be divided into 3 contracts according to groups of lines, and those would be given on a 30-year lease to consortia of private companies. They thought they could bring in the policy within 2 years. It actually took them 5 years, partly because the policy was so ridiculous, and partly because the growing strength of the campaign against it, which included strike action, public campaigning, etc., to the extent that by the time they did impose it, nobody supported the policy whatsoever, except the cabinet and the private companies that were going to profit from it. And even they didn't support it because they thought it was a good idea. The private companies supported it because they were going to make a load of money from it, and the cabinet supported it because they were desperate to prove that they weren't in hock to the unions, they weren't socialist anymore, they weren't left-wing, they were pro-business, etc. But impose it they did. They imposed it at the beginning of 2003, and what then followed was 4 years of crashes, derailments, failures, delays, cock-ups, and £1 million a week profits for the private companies. Until in 2007, one of the infracos, which was what these private consortia were called, Metronet, went into administration, and 3 years later, in 2010, the other infraco, Tube Lines, followed Metronet back into public ownership, and the PPP was over. Still left a legacy of financial wreckage, which is part of the reason, part of the cause of the attacks that are now being carried out against London Underground staff, station staff job cuts, ticket office closures, against which we are still in the middle of a dispute over which we've already taken 4 days strike action this year, and you can confidently expect us to take more within the next month or so, I think. But, and this kind of links into my third and final point, my study of the 150-year or so history of London Underground, not just of the PPP, but the whole 150-year history, it shows that London Underground does best when it is in public ownership. It shows that beyond a shadow of a doubt. It was set up by private companies, then became public, it's gone in and out of public and private. Always does best when it's in public ownership. However, that is not the full story. Public ownership is one of only 5 factors that I identify as indicating when the Underground does well and when it does not so well. The other 4 being how well funded it is. Strangely enough, the better funded it is, the better it does. It being unified rather than fragmented, so when it's run as a whole coherent London Underground rather than administratively separating out various functions or various lines, it does better. It does better when it's allowed to run as a public service rather than with a business ethos, and I include when it's under public ownership. So it used to be called London Underground. Maybe you think it still is, it's not. It was called London Underground until 1984 or 1985, London Transport Act. What the London Transport Act did was it renamed it London Underground Limited. And although the government was the sole shareholder, that legislative framework was all about saying you must function as though you were a private business, even though you're not. And the 5th factor that determines how well London Underground does is it does better, and you can trace this through its history, when it is under the control of a London body, preferably an elected London body, than when it's under the control of the national government. And that is one point I've made that people might like to discuss or disagree with, gives me a bit of a problem with the term nationalisation. I wouldn't call for London Underground to be nationalised. I think it should be fully in public ownership, but it should be in the ownership of London, under a democratically elected London body, and generally because that might apply to other public services as well, I would generally prefer to talk about public ownership rather than nationalisation, because nationalisation does suggest a very specific form of public ownership, i.e. ownership by the national government. But the other thing we also have to remember about nationalisation is this. British Rail and other previously publicly owned industries and companies were not perfect. In fact, they were very, very far from perfect. The pay and conditions of the workers was often absolutely awful. The service they provided was not very good. There were fat cat oppressive bosses in those publicly owned industries almost as much as there were in the private sector. So our campaign, our fight for nationalisation or public ownership should not be a fight that looks nostalgically at the past to demand the return of nationalised industries under that model, under that bureaucratic model that in fact was one of the things that smoothed the way for the Tories to privatise industries. They let them become so bad under public ownership that people thought they couldn't get any worse if they were privatised. So instead of that, I think we need a forward-looking, positive policy for public ownership of public services. It's not just about public ownership, but it's also about the other factors I just talked about London Underground, but about the democratic control of public services by the people who work in them and by the people who use those services. And in public transport, the way I would model that, the way I'd explain that, I think is that the London Underground and the railways and other forms of public transport should be run under a democratic workers and passengers plan that's put together and carried out by elected, recallable delegates of workers and of passengers. So, the question that we're looking at the meeting tonight is it time to re-nationalise UK PLC? And I'm going to give a qualified yes to that statement, because yes to public ownership, I prefer the term public ownership to nationalisation, but we must say more than that too. We want public services that are genuinely for need and for service and not for profit, and they should be democratically run by the people who work in them and by the people who use them. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Janine. And as a regular commuter from London to Brighton myself, I appreciate the fact you only came in just less than 1 minute late. So that's very
It's within
impressive.
the timetable.
It is within the timetable. I couldn't have got any money back for that, let me put it that way. Our next speaker